I would be worried if everybody across the board was like, yeah, that was a good movie. It's much more exciting to me when you get, a group of people who are like coming up to you and really, really excited about it. And then there are other people who walk out literally saying it was the worst movie I've ever seen. Having those two extremes to me is the mark of the type of movie that I want to make. So there's no other way it could be made. I mean, this is a movie that is very odd and is not for everyone. There's the people who love this movie tend to really love it and get into it, but it's definitely not something that everybody's going to get on board for.
Well, here we go. Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi is one of the most impactful films on modern pop culture. Not so much because the film was universally beloved, but because this film ripped the fandom apart. It was after this movie that film discourse in general seemed to regress into its worst self. But if we were to just examine the Star Wars community, it seems like fans were at war with each other after the release of this movie. So many people either passionately loved this movie or hated it so much that to this day, all these years later, they cannot forgive the sins Rian Johnson made. Why is this the case? How did a movie about space wizards and rebels become this nuke in the fandom? How did this movie ruin any hopes of this trilogy for some while carrying it to great heights for others? And as a second movie in a trilogy, does this movie serve its intended goal? Hello everybody and welcome to another video. My name is The Goldman and today we're gonna talk about Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi all these years later. Contrary to some revisionist historians, the lead up to The Last Jedi was filled with hype. The Force Awakens at the time was seen by many as a successful re-entry into the franchise or as a cheap rehash of A New Hope. But either way, almost every Star Wars fan was dying to see this movie. Being involved in the Star Wars fandom between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi was so much fun. People kept speculating constantly about the secrets of the sequel trilogy or what would happen to certain characters. The two most discussed topics were Rey's parents and Snoke's origins. The amount of theories about these two topics was staggering to say the least. I will never forget some of the most ridiculous theories that people had about who Snoke really was. But Rian Johnson kept promising his viewers that this movie was not going to go the way they thought. And well, when the movie came out, people were not happy. It turns out Rey's parents were no one. They were some random people who sold Rey away and died. And even more egregious to some was that we got no answers to who Snoke was. He was just killed off and treated as an afterthought. The phrase that spawned from the discourse of this movie was subverting expectations. Rian Johnson had a goal of subverting expectations and thus made decisions that split the viewers. Many people loved these decisions and many people hated them. The term subverting expectations kinda got a negative connotation because of this movie, but I think it's important to elaborate on this because subverting expectations can be a great narrative decision or an awful one. In order to subvert expectations, you can't just take a trope and do the exact opposite for shock value. For example, if in The Last Jedi, Rey and Kylo fought the guards and then afterwards Shrek walked in through the doors and started dancing, this would certainly subvert expectations. I bet you no one thought Shrek would be in the movie, but this would be a poor example of subverting expectations because Shrek is not a Star Wars character and there's no message behind the trope you're subverting. In order to subvert expectations effectively, there needs to be a trope that you're subverting and you need to be doing it for a reason other than shock value. I'm gonna use Game of Thrones as an example, so spoilers if you haven't watched that show. Ned Stark dying was certainly an expectation that was subverted. Ned Stark is the protagonist of the series and is a good man. We expect him to be the one to lead the fight against the bad guys and save the day. But no, he dies. The trope that is being subverted here is that of the protagonist saving the day. But this subversion also sends a message that in the Game of Thrones Wars universe, no one is safe, including the main character. This is a good subversion of expectations. At the end of Game of Thrones, the writers decided to have Arya Stark kill the Night King, not Jon Snow. The trope that is being subverted here is that the main hero, Jon Snow, would be the one to kill the Night King, but instead it was someone else. But it seems like the goal of this decision was simply to shock the viewers. Any sense of a satisfying conclusion to the Night King story was thrown away so the viewers would be surprised. This was a poor subversion of expectations. Moving back to The Last Jedi, this movie has plenty of subversions, but I'm gonna focus on the main two, and why I think one was done effectively, and why one left a lot to be desired. I love the decision to make Rey's parents nobodies. And by the way, for the sake of this argument, I am going to ignore the fact that in The Rise of Skywalker, they completely undid this moment. The trope that is being subverted here is that the main Force user has to be related to someone else who is strong with the Force. Kylo Ren is the son of Leia who is strong with the Force, and that's why he's strong. Luke Skywalker was the son of Darth Vader who was strong in the Force, and that's why he's strong. Anakin is literally the son of the Force, which is why he is so strong. So the expectation is that Rey is the daughter of someone strong with the Force. But nope, Rey is just the daughter of some random people. The message that is sent here is one of democratizing the Force. You don't need to come from somewhere special to be special yourself. Star Wars fans have been trained to believe that you must be someone's son or daughter to be strong in the Force. But throughout all of Star Wars history, Jedi were not allowed to have kids. So in a way, everyone who was a Jedi came from nowhere. So having Rey just be nobody was a reminder of that, and it ties into Rey's story nicely, which I'll talk about in a bit. This is a good example of subverting expectations. Now let's look at the death of Snoke. Killing off Snoke was certainly surprising. The expectation here is that the big bad of the trilogy would die in the third movie, not the second. The other expectation is that since Snoke appears for the first time in the 7th installment in the franchise, that there must be some grand reason why he decided to show up now and never before. So Rian Johnson decides to kill Snoke off in the second movie and not give us any answers of his origins. I like the decision to kill him off. That I feel was an expectation well subverted, but not giving us any answers was a poor decision. And yes, The Rise of Skywalker does explain where he came from, but it feels like the only reason they gave that explanation was because of the backlash for a lack of an explanation in The Last Jedi. The reason this was a poor example of subverting expectations is because it's pretty important to understand why Snoke exists. Some will say there was no explanation of where Palpatine came from in the original trilogy, but the original trilogy were the first 3 Star Wars movies. We as the viewer can just accept that the Sith gained power and Palpatine became the Emperor. The status quo was not changed. With the sequels, we saw in the previous trilogy that the only 2 Sith left both died. Now Snoke shows up and there's no explanation as to why. The status quo has changed and we do not know why. If the sequels were the first Star Wars movies, then this isn't a problem, but you can't ignore the existence of the other 2 trilogies. A great analogy I love to use is with the color of a hotel room. Say you walk into a hotel room for the first time and the walls are white. You think nothing of it. The walls are white. Cool. You leave the room for 5 minutes and you come back and now the walls are black. You would ask yourself, 5 minutes ago the walls were white. Why are they black now? Who changed the color of the walls? How did the color of the walls change so quickly? These are natural questions because the status quo changed. Snoke's existence is a change in the status quo and we need an explanation why. Subverting expectations can be a powerful tool to really surprise your audience and send a powerful message. But you must be careful because if done poorly, it can really annoy your viewers. The Last Jedi has moments where it successfully subverts expectations and moments where it does so poorly. For the next few portions of this video, I'd like to discuss the main characters and their stories in The Last Jedi. The first character I would like to focus on is Rey, because, well, she's the main character. Now, Rey, I believe, is the single most misunderstood character in the Star Wars franchise. Most people love to focus on Rey's external struggles or lack thereof. As the protagonist of a Star Wars trilogy, it's only fair to compare her to her counterparts in Luke and Anakin. Luke and Anakin both struggled immensely externally, and what I mean by externally are are physical obstacles that they had to overcome. Anakin had to finish the pod race, Anakin got his arm chopped off, Anakin got burned alive, Luke had to blow up the Death Star, Luke got his ass handed to him by Vader and lost a hand, and Luke had to defeat Vader and turn him back to the light side. Of course, I'm not saying that these characters had no internal struggles. There's probably no one who struggled more internally than Anakin did. My point is that these characters struggled externally on numerous occasions, while with Rey, at least in these first two movies, she doesn't. I'm not going to cover her story again from The Force Awakens. You can watch my whole 57-minute video on that if you'd like, but a main point I had in that video is that Rey's struggles are pretty much all internal, and that continues in The Last Jedi. From a simple plot perspective, Rey doesn't do that much in this movie. She gets rejected by Luke, she talks to Kylo and Luke a couple of times, she leaves Luke to turn Kylo, she gets interrogated by Snoke but saved by Kylo, she fights off some guards, she fails to turn Kylo back to the light side, she lifts some rocks, and that's her story. So Rey has pretty much no external struggles, and I believe that is the biggest reason why people call her a Mary Sue, because she doesn't struggle all that much defeating Kylo. She doesn't struggle all that much in her Force training. She does struggle against Snoke, but she doesn't struggle fighting the guards, and she doesn't struggle lifting rocks. But as I said earlier, 99% of Rey's struggles are all internal. If you were to really examine Rey as an individual human being and not as a potential Jedi, Rey is one of the most wildly insecure people in the Star Wars galaxy. I would argue her insecurity rivals that of Anakin's. In the first two movies, Rey in her heart of hearts wants one thing, and that is belonging. In The Force Awakens, she hides away on Jakku because she only thinks her parents can give her the belonging she seeks. She learns that isn't true and she moves on to find Luke. In this movie, Rey is constantly seeking external validation. She looks to Luke for answers about her place in the galaxy, she literally says as much, and then she looks to Kylo. Have you ever met those girls who seem to hop from one boyfriend to another and they're afraid to be single? Well, that's pretty much Rey minus the boyfriend part. Rey is an incredibly dependent person. She's always looking to other people to find answers. In The Force Awakens, she grew attached to Han rather quickly. She followed him around and often sought his approval. And The Last Jedi begins the same way, with her seeking Luke's approval, but she doesn't get it. Without someone else's approval and guidance, she's lost. And this is the core of what Rey's arc is in this movie. Rey wants belonging. She wants answers about her place in the galaxy. But what she needs to realize is that she's not going to get the answers she wants from other people. Only she can define what her place is in the galaxy, and once that happens, then she can find belonging. If Rey were to find her parents, if Luke were to secretly be her dad, then everything is figured out for her. She's the daughter of Luke Skywalker. Her belonging is with Luke. Or if Luke were to officially take her in as a student, then her belonging is with her master. But without her family or master, she's lost. Twice in the first half of this movie does Rey specifically ask Luke for help. She asks Luke for help shortly after they meet, and then during Luke's second lesson, she tells him she needs someone to show her her place in the galaxy. These insecurities that Rey has, this need to attach herself to someone else, is why she gravitates to Kylo. I'm going to touch on this a bit more when I talk about Kylo, but what's so fascinating about Rey and Kylo's dynamic is that the two of them wish they were the other person. Rey wants the family that Kylo Ren has. She wants a mother and father who are there and want to be with their child, while Kylo wants the independence that Rey has. He wants to be removed from the parents who love him so he can fully embrace the dark side. So once they actually start to get to know each other, they are naturally attracted. Their first Force bond is pretty much just establishing the rules of the bond, so there's not much to talk about there. During their second bond, it's clear Rey hates Kylo, not only because he killed Han Solo, the man Rey looked up to, but because Kylo killed his father. There is nothing Rey would want more in her world than to be with a parent. She waited year after year wasting her life away on Jakku, hoping her mom or dad or both would come back to her. Yet Kylo had a dad and he killed him. Rey simply cannot understand how someone could do this, and she hates Kylo for it. But the way their second conversation ends shocks her. She calls Kylo a monster and he says, "Yes, I am." Truly evil people don't believe they're monsters. Only someone who is deeply hurt believes they're a monster. So when Kylo says, "Yes, I am," Rey is taken aback by this because it's obvious there is some pain behind his voice. So by the time they speak for a third time, Rey confronts Kylo on this. Now, of course, Rey is overwhelmed by seeing Adam Driver's chiseled body because she's probably never seen an attractive man in her life. If you're a straight girl, you'd probably be overwhelmed too, going from seeing this fat lard every day to seeing this. But anyway, so the first thing Rey asks is, why did he kill his father? Rey simply cannot understand how someone would murder their father, and this is the conversation that makes Rey start to empathize with Kylo. I continue to be baffled that people don't understand Rey's struggle in this trilogy, when Kylo literally spells it out to the audience. Rey says she doesn't understand, and he says, and I quote, "No, your parents threw you away like garbage, but you can't stop needing them. It's your greatest weakness, looking for them everywhere, in Han Solo, and now in Skywalker." This translates to, you should understand how I feel. My parents abandoned me just like you, and just like you, I still need them. It's both of our greatest weaknesses. You used Han Solo as a father figure, and now you do the same with Luke Skywalker. So when you phrase it like that, of course Rey would begin to empathize with Kylo. And after Kylo tells his version of what happened that night at the Jedi Temple, she begins to see him a bit as a victim. So at this point in the story, Rey is someone who is incredibly lonely, she has serious abandonment issues, and she's not getting help from Luke. Who better to go to than someone who is incredibly lonely, someone who has abandonment issues, and someone from his perspective didn't get any help from Luke? Human beings naturally gravitate to those with shared experience. It is hardwired into our DNA. So she goes to the Force Cave to get some answers, but she doesn't get any. And then she talks to Kylo again, and she says she's never felt so alone. This is a girl who grew up miserably on Jakku with no family, and now she's never felt so alone, and I don't blame her. When you're living on Jakku, you kinda expect to feel lonely, but after what she's been through, you'd think she'd find belonging. But nope, she's still lonely. So when you take this all into account, it makes perfect sense that she would want to touch hands with Kylo. But of course, Luke interrupts things and Rey is pissed. Quick tangent, one of the dumbest criticisms of this movie is that Rey is a Mary Sue because she beat Luke in this fight. You are either an idiot if you believe this, or you are so incredibly disingenuous that you ignored what happened. When the two are whacking sticks, Luke is toying with her. He dodges her hits and just casually hits her on the back. Nothing is more disrespectful in a fight than grabbing your opponent's weapon and tossing it to the side. But since Rey grabs a lightsaber, Luke backs off. And this somehow means she won? This is like if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was fighting Danny DeVito. Of course, The Rock would kick Danny DeVito's ass. But say the two were fighting and then Danny DeVito whipped out a shotgun. I bet you The Rock would back off. This is basically what happened here. So yeah, if you say Rey beat Luke in this duel and she's a Mary Sue because of it, I cannot take you seriously. But anyway, Luke tells Rey his true version of the story, and what Rey says next I find to be interesting. She says she saw Ben's future and that he will turn back to the light side, and that he will not bow before Snoke. This is technically true. Kylo did not bow before Snoke, and he did turn back to the light side, but part of me wonders if Rey actually saw this, or that she wanted to see this. Because at this point in the story, there is no one better for Rey to find belonging with than Kylo. As I've stated for the past few minutes, they both feel as if they are going through the same thing. I believe that Rey is just saying this, but deep down she wants to go to Kylo because he's the next guy that can give her the answers she needs. Luke rejects her again, and she leaves to confront Kylo. So the two meet and they talk in the elevator. Rey tells Kylo she can help him too. From Kylo's point of view, he too wants to join Rey, but on the dark side. And to do that, he must kill Snoke. Rey just gets toyed with left and right. Kylo saves her, and then they fight the guards. Now, of course, Rey defeating these guards is another instance of people calling her a Mary Sue. But may I say this, you guys are criminally underrating how big of an advantage it is to have the Force in a fight. Anakin, a 9-year-old boy, was able to win a pod race and destroy the Trade Federation ship because he had the Force. Luke was able to blow up the Death Star with a perfect shot because he had the Force. Rey has the Force, but she's a Mary Sue because she kills 4 guards in a fight while Kylo kills the rest. But anyway, they win the fight, and Rey of course thinks Kylo is now good. But think again, a lot of people misinterpret this scene. Kylo doesn't tell Rey her parents are no one. She tells herself this. Now, someone who is uneducated and doesn't understand human beings will say, Rey knew this whole time her parents were dead, so why did she keep waiting for them? If you believe this, then you've never heard of a repressed memory. Repressed memories are memories that we unconsciously avoid thinking about, usually because of a traumatic experience. These memories are thought to be unconsciously blocked for several years and are recovered later, often from a trigger. I wonder what this sounds like. Oh, that's right, exactly what Rey went through. Rey's abandonment was so traumatizing to her that it became a repressed memory. And may I add, having Rey not be related to anybody was such a brilliant choice for this character. Rey didn't need to be related to anyone. She could just be great by her own accord. But we all know how The Rise of Skywalker handles this, but as Maz Kanata says, that's a story for another time. So Kylo uses Rey's devastation to try and recruit her to the dark side. At this point in the story, let's analyze Rey's point of view. Rey wants nothing more than belonging. The one one person in the galaxy who knows the most about her and has similar shared experience is offering her to join him. Her most recent mentor has kind of been a dick to her. Her other mentor is dead. Yeah, she has a close friend in Finn, but she met the supposed good guys literally once before, and that was at the end of The Force Awakens. Besides that one experience that lasted less than a day, she knows nothing about the Resistance and what they represent. That same organization is getting blown up bit by bit right in front of her. It is kind of the obvious choice here to join Kylo in the dark side. If Rey were to reject him, she's basically telling herself that she needs to find her belonging on her own. No more going to other people. And she does that. This moment here is the culmination of her arc. Her rejecting Kylo is also her accepting the hard truth that she's been afraid of for so long. She's not going to find the answers she needs from other people, only herself. So does Rey now hate Kylo Ren? I don't think so. I believe at this moment, Rey still believes that there is good left in Kylo, but she also acknowledges that she can't be the one to save him. And she kinda says as much in The Rise of Skywalker, that she would have taken Ben's hand. In her mind, Kylo is not ready to be with her. When he is, she will be there, but until then, he's on his own. Now, what it means to be with her is up to your interpretation. You could think this is something romantic or simply just being on the same side of the Force. Either way, at the end of The Last Jedi, she thinks Kylo isn't ready to be with her, and she metaphorically and literally closes the door on him. And that's pretty much Rey's story. After she rejects Kylo, she manages to find her way back to the Falcon. She helps out in the Battle of Crate a little bit, she lifts some rocks, and then talks to Leia. I frankly love Rey's story in this movie. George Lucas has always said that Star Wars is about finding your place in the world. If Star Wars is about people finding their place in the world, then Rey's story is fundamental Star Wars because it's about her finding her place in the world. I love the message that her story sends. Sure, other people can help you out in life, but only you can give yourself answers to your place in the world, no one else. And that's a powerful message. Now, just because I love Rey's story, that doesn't mean I think it's perfect. This story suffers from the same issue as The Force Awakens, and it's that Rey never suffers the consequences of her flaws. In a traditional character arc, it's important that your main character suffers some consequences of their flaws to help them grow and change. Luke got mollywomped by Vader, and Anakin nuked his life beyond repair. But Rey doesn't suffer any consequences of her insecurity. She takes a major risk by confronting Kylo on the supremacy, and while she fails at accomplishing her goal in converting Kylo, she isn't negatively affected by it. She just gets upset and leaves. If Rey genuinely suffered some consequences of her flaws, like losing an arm or getting hurt or someone else getting hurt, I think a lot less people would call her a Mary Sue. But because she doesn't suffer any consequences, people think she's still flawless. One other minor point I'm gonna concede is that her managing to blow up all these TIE fighters is kinda overpowered. The Force Awakens made an effort to show us how hard it was for Finn to blow up 2 TIE fighters, but in The Last Jedi, Rey managed to blow up 3 in one shot and destroy a bunch of others. That is a moment I would agree is a bit Mary Sue-ish, but that's the only ground I'm gonna give up, so take it or leave it. In short, I love Rey's story. She's a criminally underrated character, but her story isn't perfect. Up next, we have the Mighty Kylo Ren. Now, if there's one thing about the sequels that isn't controversial, it's that Kylo Ren is the best character in The Last Jedi. Kylo is a nuanced villain who is similar yet incredibly unique within the Star Wars universe. So let's analyze his story. The movie picks up right where the previous movie left off. I know I spoke about this in my Force Awakens video, but I need to clarify again what happened at the end of that movie. Kylo Ren thought killing his father would further entrench him into the dark side. Deep down, Kylo loves his parents, so if he can kill one of them, then there is nothing left for him to love and he will be consumed by hate. But that's not what happened. When Kylo killed Han, the act made him more conflicted than ever before. The dark side didn't consume him, guilt did. Han in his final moments let his son know he still loved him by touching his face. This moment ruined Kylo and is the major reason why he lost to Rey in that duel. People can say that Kylo was shot by the bowcaster or that Rey had training with the staff all they want, but the fact that Kylo was this emotionally distracted was the reason Rey beat him. Here's an analogy I'd like to use. If I had to play LeBron James in a one-on-one game of basketball, he would torch me. But if right before the game I murdered all of his kids and his wife right in front of him and then asked him to play, there's a chance I would win because what person in their right mind would be able to play a sport right after their family was murdered. This is basically what happened to Kylo. He was devastated by killing his father, and it distracted him during his fight with Rey. And to begin The Last Jedi, Snoke basically confirms this. He says the deed split your spirit to the bone, which basically means you were too distracted because you killed your father. I also love how Kylo says, "I killed Han Solo. When the moment came, I didn't hesitate," when we all saw how much he hesitated. Snoke ends up berating him, and Kylo is pissed. One aspect of storytelling that I consistently talk about in my videos is active characters. Effective characters are characters that make decisions that reveal who they are. Throughout this movie, Kylo Ren makes decisions that reveal to us who he really is. During the initial attack on the Resistance fleet, Kylo Ren has the chance to murder his mother, but he doesn't. This shows to us that Kylo is not even remotely close to being consumed by the dark side. Now, one aspect of the scene that's mildly confusing is if Kylo knows his mom doesn't die, because he clearly sees her being blown out of the ship, but for the rest of the movie, it's never addressed if he knows she's alive or not. In The Rise of Skywalker, he knows Leia is alive, but it's not clear if he realizes this in The Last Jedi, between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, or if he knew she never died in the first place, because his knowledge on the well-being of his mother definitely matters when, during the Battle of Crate, he tells his officers no quarter and no prisoners, implying he's asking them to potentially kill his mother. But moving on from this, let's talk about his relationship with Rey. I kinda touched on a fair amount of this when talking about Rey, but let's look at things from his perspective. Just like Rey, Kylo doesn't understand why they have a Force bond. When they talk for the second time, Kylo is curious if Rey knows what happened to him, because even though Kylo is clearly on the dark side and he acknowledges this, he still believes he is a victim of an attempted murder from Luke. Rey at first has no interest in learning about his past, and she calls him a monster, and Kylo says, "Yes, I am." As I stated before, there is such a feeling of pain in this line. What makes Kylo such a complex character are his reasons for why he is on the dark side. With Anakin, it's pretty clear. He wants to save his wife, and his faith in the Jedi is breaking. With Kylo, it's not so simple. Thinking Luke was trying to kill him is not the sole reason he's on the dark side. It's just the straw that broke the camel's back. Some may say that it's because his parents sent him away to train with Luke, but I don't think that's the entire story. The reason Ben was sent to train with Luke was not simply because Ben had the Force. His parents sensed a growing darkness with him, and they hoped Luke could help him. Throughout his life, Ben always felt everyone saw him as some sort of monster. He felt his parents saw him as a monster. Why else would they send him away? He felt his uncle saw him as a monster. Why else would he try to kill him? I know this doesn't count, but his fellow students in the Kylo Ren comic saw him as a monster too, and now Rey sees him as a monster. I think at some point, Ben just snapped and said, "Everyone keeps calling me a monster? Fine, I'll be a monster." And at its core, that is why Ben Solo became Kylo Ren. So when Kylo Ren says, "Yes, I am," in response to Rey calling him a monster, it's probably because it's not the first time he's felt like someone was calling him a monster. The next time they talk is the classic Ben Swolo scene. And may I say here, I'm so glad they didn't make Kylo a bitch. Imagine if when Rey told him to put on a shirt, he's like, "Okay, I'll put on a shirt just to make you feel more comfortable." That would be such a bitch move. But instead, he just stands there and says nothing. What a boss. So Kylo tells Rey his truth about the night he destroyed Luke's temple. The reason he does this is because deep down he believes he and Rey have gone through the same thing. When he entered her mind in The Force Awakens, he could feel how lonely she was from her abandonment. Some may look at this movie as Kylo trying to manipulate Rey into joining the dark side, but I don't believe that. Palpatine, for example, didn't care about Anakin. He just wanted Anakin's power. In The Empire Strikes Back, I don't think Vader really cares about Luke yet. That happens in Return of the Jedi. In this movie, Kylo genuinely cares about Rey. He empathizes with her and wants her to join him. As I stated before, people with shared experience gravitate towards each other. Kylo Ren, a man who feels alone, wants someone with shared experience to be with him. This is why he's so willing to open up to her in the hand-touching scene. He tells her she's not alone, and the two proceed to touch hands. This moment right here is probably the most intimate either one has been with another person in their entire entire life. These are not the eyes of someone who is trying to manipulate someone else. The next time the two meet up is right before they confront Snoke. At this moment, I think Kylo knows he needs to kill Snoke, but he has no clue how he's gonna do it. So Snoke proceeds to interrogate Rey, and you know what's a detail I noticed years after this movie came out? After Snoke tosses Rey to the ground and Kylo's lightsaber lands in front of him spinning, that's when he realizes how he was gonna kill Snoke. He sees the spinning lightsaber on the ground, and right after that, he happens to look directly at Snoke. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but this was such an awesome detail I hadn't noticed before. So Kylo proceeds to kill Snoke, he helps kill all the guards, and then makes his proposal to Rey. One thing I want to add quickly is how big of a deal Kylo killing Snoke is. Sure, it's Sith tradition for the apprentice to kill the master, but here it's more than that. Snoke was Kylo's abuser. It's this big deal because the abuser, the man who's been torturing him for the past few years, is now dead. But anyway, now even though I don't think Kylo is genuinely trying to manipulate Rey and he does care about her, it's still important to remember that Kylo is on the dark side. When Kylo tells Rey the truth about her parents and tells her she's nothing but not to him, I see that as a gaslight. He's playing into Rey's biggest insecurities here. She sees herself as nothing because her parents are no one. So Kylo is telling her this and basically saying, I'm the only one who sees you as something special, so join me. May I just say this? Adam Driver's acting here may be some of the best acting in the entire franchise. The delivery of please to her is filled with innocence and this desperate need for her. There's a reason why Martin Scorsese said Adam Driver is the best actor of his generation. Isn't that kind of crazy that we got one of the best working actors alive to be the main villain in a Star Wars trilogy? That's absolutely nuts. But anyway, Rey rejects Kylo and he's pissed. The moment when he starts choking Hux is the moment where people think Kylo has fully embraced the dark side, but I disagree completely. He's pissed because the girl he just asked out said no, so he's not happy. Kylo goes to Crate and we get a few moments of him yelling, which is kind of funny to be honest, and then we get to his confrontation with Luke. A lot of people call Kylo an idiot for getting distracted here, but I don't blame him. Remember, this is a man who spent the entire first movie looking for a map to find Luke, and prior to that, he thinks Luke had a failed assassination attempt on him. I don't blame Kylo for taking the opportunity to make sure he kills Luke. Granted, we all know it was just a distraction, but this entire sequence just shows Kylo's biggest flaws. Similarly to what I said before, people look at Kylo here as someone who is fully consumed with the dark side, and I disagree. Throughout this trilogy up to this point, how many times has Kylo said things that he knows aren't completely true? He says he'll destroy Rey, but we all know that's not gonna happen. We just saw him pour his heart to her. A great way to show a character is conflicted is when their actions don't match their words. Kylo throughout this movie says one thing and does another. So Kylo ends up realizing he fucked up and has one last bond with Rey. And I'm sorry, but this is not the face of someone who's consumed by the dark side and wants to destroy the girl he is looking at. This is a man who feels partially defeated and lonely. And that is the story of Kylo Ren in this movie. Kylo is one of my favorite characters in Star Wars, and this movie is the major reason why. I pretty much love everything about him in this movie, and it is clear why even the biggest sequel haters respect his character. Before we move on to talk about the most controversial aspect of this movie, let's shift gears to the other half of this movie and talk about Finn and Poe. First, we'll discuss Finn. Finn is a sensitive topic to discuss. Not many opinions are shared about the sequel trilogy, but one that a lot do share is that Finn was pretty much wasted. He had arguably the most unique story point in The Force Awakens, a stormtrooper turned rebel turned potential Jedi. The Force Awakens is by far Finn's best movie. Even though Rey is the clear protagonist of that movie, Finn is more than just a supporting character. He is also a co-protagonist. As the trilogy progresses, people love to say that he was sidelined by Rey and Kylo's stories. Many point to The Last Jedi as the movie that sidelined Finn, but I disagree with this. As you will see in a moment, Finn's story in this movie has a lot of problems, but what you can't say is that he was sidelined because he is the focus of an entire half of this movie. Rey is pretty much the focus of the story surrounding all the force-wielding characters, but when it comes to the other half of the movie, the story about the Resistance versus the First Order, Finn is the center of that story. Now, his story wasn't done well, but it's inarguable that Rian Johnson devoted an entire half of this story to Finn. When I do eventually talk about The Rise of Skywalker, you will notice that that movie completely sidelined Finn. He doesn't have his own part of the story that centers around him like The Last Jedi does. So the next time you say Finn was sidelined in The Last Jedi, I would ask you to reconsider. But moving on, let's look at Finn's story in The Last Jedi and why it doesn't work. What is Finn's story about in this movie? Well, Finn's story is about learning to fight for a cause. He begins the story only caring for himself and for Rey, and ends it willing to sacrifice himself for the Resistance. Many people love to point out how this movie basically redoes his arc in The Force Awakens, because he began that movie running away from the First Order and ended it fighting for the Resistance. But this idea that Finn's story in The Force Awakens is about him learning to fight for a cause is a fundamental misunderstanding of his character arc. The Force Awakens was not about Finn learning to fight for a cause. It was about Finn learning to confront his demons from the past instead of running away from it. Finn was scared of the First Order, but at the end of the movie, he stands up to it. There is no indication in that movie that Finn is willing to fight for anything besides himself and Rey. When they arrive on Starkiller Base, Finn admits he has no clue how to turn the shields down and that he's just trying to save Rey. He basically lied to the Resistance and almost screwed them so he can only help his friend. Now, he's not actively trying to undermine the Resistance, he's more than willing to help them out, but he's not committed to them. Once he saves Rey, he fights Kylo, gets knocked out, and just wakes up on a Resistance ship. So to begin this movie, it makes perfect sense that Finn would try to flee the Resistance if it means he and Rey could be safe. Finn has a clear flaw. He's only willing to fight for himself and Rey and is apathetic towards the larger cause. As I stated before, Finn does change by the end of the story. By the end, he's willing to die for the Resistance. So what's the problem with his character arc then? Well, characters need time to undergo a change. If a character has one belief and then instantly changes his or her belief, that is not a character arc. That is a character jump. Finn begins the movie wanting to run away. Rose kidnaps him, they talk about the hyperspace tracker, then they talk to Poe about the plan to find a master codebreaker, and boom, Finn hands Poe the pendant, basically signaling to us that he trusts the Resistance and is willing to go on this dangerous mission for them. In the matter of only a few minutes of screen time for Finn, he goes from attempting to run away to willing to risk his life for them. This is not a character arc. This is a character jump. So after this moment in the movie, there's no tension about where Finn's allegiances lie because we know in the first act of the movie that he's changed and he's willing to fight for the Resistance. Let's compare this to Andor because frankly, his story is actually quite similar. Both are about characters who only want them and their closest friends and family to be safe, but they go on stories where they learn to fight for a larger cause. The big difference is that it took Cassian 12 episodes before he finally committed himself to the rebellion. In The Last Jedi, it only took Finn a few minutes before he committed himself to the Resistance. So ask yourself this. After this moment, what's the point of Finn's story? Sure, from a plot perspective, they need to help out the Resistance, but considering the Resistance versus First Order conflict is far less interesting than the Rey versus Kylo plot, you need a compelling story with the characters to keep this half of the movie engaging. Canto Bight is often the most criticized aspect of this movie, and the reason why is because nothing that happens here is important to the story. There's a commentary on war profiteering and child slavery, which is okay to discuss. The original Star Wars movies were all about discussing political issues, especially the prequels, but the themes of war profiteering and child slavery don't matter because Finn has already committed himself to the Resistance. Later on in this movie, the culmination of Finn's arc is supposed to be the moment right here. Phasma calls him scum and he replies with rebel scum, basically calling himself a rebel. But this moment has no emotional impact because, again, he committed himself to the Resistance earlier in this movie. What's rather unfortunate is that you can make one minor change to Finn's story that solves pretty much everything. You can keep Canto Bight, you can keep the discussions about war profiteering and child slavery, and you can keep DJ and him trying to convince Finn that he's better off not joining his side. You can even keep the failed sacrifice at the end of the movie. The only change you need to make to Finn's story to make it far more compelling is that he doesn't hand Poe the pendant for Rey. Think about it. We know Finn cares about Rey more than anything. Him handing that pendant to Poe tells us that he's not gonna bail on the Resistance again because abandoning the Resistance means abandoning Rey. But if he takes the pendant with him to Canto Bight, then in the back of our minds, Finn's loyalty still remains a question. Canto Bight is completely be safe from the First Order. If he has the pendant with him, he can bail on Rose and lead Rey to safety. The thing he tried to do in the beginning of the movie. There should have been moments throughout the Canto Bight sequence where Finn ponders bailing on the Resistance, but as Rose teaches him about the child slavery and the war profiteering, he starts to slowly change his mind about his apathy. When he has those conversations with DJ about living free and not joining, those conversations become far more intriguing because if he has the pendant, then he can take DJ's advice and leave. The pendant is not just a tracker for Rey, it's a metaphorical symbol of Finn's allegiances. As long as he has the pendant, he can bail on the Resistance with no consequences. But once he gives it to Poe, then his allegiances now lie with the Resistance. He should keep pondering leaving the Resistance up until the point where they are captured. Once he is captured and is betrayed by DJ, he has made a decision, and thus when he tells Phasma he is rebel scum, that is now the culmination of his character arc. And it would be a character arc because it took the entire movie for him to grow, not just a few scenes. Isn't it incredible how one minor change can fix an entire character arc? So those are my thoughts on Finn's story. One small narrative decision pretty much derailed his entire character arc, and thus led to an uncompelling and uninteresting story. Now, we can't talk about Finn's story without talking about poor Rose Tico. I feel bad for Rose. She's a sweet character, she's kind, she has a good heart, and she's a breath of fresh air for Star Wars. It's not every day we see some background engineer thrusted into becoming a hero. So with that said, why does almost everyone hate her? People often compare her to Jar Jar for the position of the most hated Star Wars character. She doesn't just bumble around making dumbass poop jokes like Jar Jar. I wouldn't say she has an incredibly annoying personality, so why is she so frustrating? Well, Rose is a walking contradiction. When we first meet Rose, she is crying over the loss of her sister, who had just sacrificed herself to save the fleet. Meanwhile, flash forward to the end of the movie, she sacrifices herself so Finn can't sacrifice himself to save the Resistance. She is stopping Finn from doing the exact thing her sister did. Now, I don't think this was Rian Johnson's intention. The famous line, "It's not about fighting what you hate, but saving what you love," has been clowned by a lot of people. They think the meaning of that line is that you shouldn't sacrifice yourself. And I don't blame people for thinking this, because given the context of that scene, that's kinda what it means. But what's unfortunate is that the quote is actually a really powerful quote, used in the worst possible way. What she's basically telling Finn is that he shouldn't fight against the First Order, but for the Resistance. Some may say this is the same thing, but I disagree. So even though it's a great quote, its usage of it in this movie is a major head scratcher, and this makes the scene feel incredibly dumb. Also, the kiss is pretty cringe. There's no indication that either one showed romantic interest in each other, so this kiss feels weird. Why else do most people not like her? Well, when we first meet Rose, she is tasering scared rebels trying to escape what they consider to be certain death. Later on in the film, we watch her preach about the evils of the First Order and how you shouldn't force people to work against their will. Finn is someone who didn't sign up to be a part of the Resistance. He kinda just ended up here by circumstance. And as I said earlier, she's kind of forcing Finn to be a part of the Resistance, something she's criticizing the First Order for doing. Now, there are a lot of other reasons that I can point to, like how her stopping Finn also puts the lives of everyone else we care about at stake. Rose is kinda like an overcritical parent who is telling you everything you are doing is wrong. Trying to leave the Resistance? You're a traitor. You can't like Canto Bight, it's evil. You can't sacrifice yourself for the Resistance. It doesn't matter if you're a hero. She may be technically right, but no one wants to be told you're wrong all the time, and thus we find her annoying. Up next, we have Poe Dameron, and just like Finn, a lot of people dislike his story. Now, I'm actually more fond of his story than most, but there are some glaring issues that drag it down for me. So what is Poe's story about? Poe goes on a character arc about learning to become a leader. Poe begins the story as this hotshot pilot that is incredibly skilled, but also incredibly reckless, and ends the story as a more humble leader who is looking out for the betterment of the Resistance rather than making impulse decisions. So he does have an arc, but what's what's the problem? His arc wasn't rushed like Finn's arc, but damn is Poe's arc frustrating. So the whole point of the beginning of the movie was that even though they won the space battle over Dakar, a lot of people unnecessarily lost their lives. Poe sacrificed the lives of a dozen people just so they can destroy a dreadnought. And I actually agree with Leia here. I don't think a good leader would have acted the way Poe did. But the problem here is that had Poe not led the charge to destroy the dreadnought, then they would all be dead later on during the space chase. If the First Order had the dreadnought when they were doing the slowest space chase of all time, then they wouldn't have had the issue of being out of range from the Resistance fleet. So narratively, the story treats Poe's decision to destroy the dreadnought as a bad thing, but in reality, it saved everyone's lives. If Rian Johnson really wanted to hammer home the message that destroying the dreadnought was a waste of lives, then he should have chosen a different ship that wouldn't have posed a threat to them later on. But moving on from that plot hole, the other clear frustrating part of Poe's arc is Holdo not telling Poe the plan. Obviously, we all know that had Holdo told Poe the plan, then the whole final battle could have been avoided. Holdo is kinda like Rose in the sense that she thinks she knows best, and that is incredibly frustrating for the viewer. But I think it makes sense why Holdo didn't tell Poe the plan, but it was not made clear. In the beginning of the movie, Leia had a plan to stall the First Order so the Resistance had time to evacuate and leave. Poe knew the plan, disobeyed it, and got a bunch of people killed. So from Holdo's perspective, why would she tell Poe the plan? For all she knows, Poe could easily once again disobey his superior's orders and put the lives of others in the Resistance in danger. Hindsight is always 20/20, but at the time, Holdo's perspective makes sense to me. But this isn't well conveyed to the audience. We assume that the reason why she isn't telling Poe is simply because she doesn't trust him. But this is a plan that should be shared with everyone. If you're not going to tell someone, there better be a specific reason why that person isn't being told other than that you just don't trust them. Holdo should have just said, "Why would I tell you the plan? Last time you were told the plan, you disobeyed orders and a bunch of people got killed. How do I know you won't do the same again?" And had this been said, then this fixes another issue. So just like Finn's story, one minor change actually fixes quite a bit. Now, what do I like about Poe's story in this movie? Well, if you guys know me, you know I love it when characters face the realistic consequences of their actions. How many times in Star Wars have we seen characters do incredibly dumb things but get away with it? Frankly, we've seen characters go on these infiltration missions so many times and never get caught. I'm so glad in this movie for once characters and their dumbass plans get foiled. And not only that, but because Poe was reckless, he even got more people killed. In The Last Jedi, characters face the realistic consequences of their actions, and I love that. So Poe does have an arc in this movie. He goes from being incredibly reckless to being a leader. But the problem is that his story has a few minor plot holes, and it is incredibly frustrating. Now, the moment you guys have been waiting for. It is time we discuss Luke Skywalker. The narrative decision Rian Johnson took with this character is the single most controversial thing that Disney has done with Star Wars. So many people hate the way Luke was in this movie, and that hate is a passionate hate. Mark Hamill himself strongly disagreed with the direction Rian Johnson took this character. Well, I am here to tell you guys that you're all nuts. Even though I completely understand a lot of people's criticisms, I frankly love Luke's story in this movie. Luke's arc in The Last Jedi is one of the biggest reasons why this movie is a top-tier Star Wars movie to me. Now, what are the major reasons why people passionately dislike Luke in this movie, and how do I see it differently? Well, I think I boiled it down to two major reasons. The first one is that Luke would never ponder murdering his nephew, and the other is that Luke would never abandon his family in a time of need. So let me address these two issues, and maybe I can provide you guys with a new perspective. First, let's talk about the hut scene with Kylo Ren. I'll say this, what happened here is incredibly similar to what I spoke about with Finn and Poe. Rian Johnson has some fantastic ideas, but it's not always entirely clear. When you take this scene at face value, sure, of course, Luke would never ponder killing his nephew, because Luke is a man that would always defend his family whatever the cost. This is something we can can agree on. If someone threatens Luke's family, he freaks out. This is evident in Return of the Jedi. But what happens when someone in his family threatens someone in his family? When I watch these scenes, I pay close attention to the exact words Luke said. He would bring destruction and pain and death at the end of everything I love because of what he will become. And for the briefest moment of pure instinct, I thought I could stop it. When I see this, I ask myself, what could Luke specifically see that would freak him out this hard? What was in Kylo's future that would be more devastating than anything he thought possible? And it's simple. He saw the death of Han Solo. If you were to tell me that Luke had a vision of someone killing his best friend and then he would freak out, I would totally believe you, because Luke Skywalker freaks out when his family is threatened. If it were anyone else in front of him besides Ben and Leia, Luke probably would have murdered them. But because Luke cares for his family so much, he was able to stop himself from murdering his nephew. I simply cannot blame a guy for tapping into an instinct because he saw, as he said, the end of everything I love and the death of his best friend. This is some serious shit. So for me, it's that simple. I think if Luke saw Han being murdered, it totally makes sense he would react like this. Now, what I'm about to explain next is a total reach, I acknowledge it, but I'm not making anything up when I make this connection. All the pieces are still there. What Luke goes through in this moment is exactly what Anakin went through in Revenge of the Sith. 3 times in the Skywalker Saga did someone have a vision. When Anakin saw his mom die, when Anakin saw Padme die, and when Luke saw Han and Leia in trouble on Cloud City. And you know what happened? All 3 of those things ended up becoming true. Luke must be aware at this point that when someone has a vision, those visions must always become true. Now, I'm sure that in some offshoot book somewhere, someone had a vision that didn't become true, but I'm only looking at the main movies. And in that case, every time someone has a Force vision, they become true. Luke probably knows this after studying for 30 years to become a Jedi Master. When Anakin had a vision of his wife dying, he did everything he could to stop it, but he ended up causing it to happen. His vision still became true. You don't think at this moment right here, Luke probably knows that his vision of Han dying is gonna become true? So not only is Luke freaking out over a vision of Han dying, but he is freaking out over a vision he believes is gonna become true. And you know what? Luke could have stopped it. If Luke killed Ben, Han wouldn't be dead. But Luke stopped himself and his vision became true anyway. Imagine if I told you that someone you love deeply would be murdered in the future and there was nothing you could do to stop it. How would you react? Now, is this all a reach? I'll let you decide. It's never specifically stated that Luke saw Han die, but for me, it's a reasonable assumption that causes a lot of things to make sense. If Luke straight up told Rey that he saw Ben murder Han in his vision, then a lot of people would be more accepting of this scene. But the phrasing, the end of everything I love, is too vague and thus the audience can't make that connection. And you know what? Rian Johnson could have done a better job at conveying Luke's horror. And this is why Luke almost pondering killing Kylo doesn't bother me. When you consider the horror that probably went through Luke's mind, it all makes sense. And this ties into the other topic of discussion. Luke ran away and abandoned his family. This is simply not true. To say that Luke ran away is an implication that he was scared and just gave up on everyone. Luke did not go to Octu because he was scared or because he just gave up on saving his family. Luke went to Octu because he believes he and the Jedi are the problem in the galaxy. Even though it was only an instinct, he believes he is the reason why Ben Solo turned to the dark side. Luke exiled himself because he doesn't think he can trust himself anymore to do the right thing. Why do you think he's so depressed? There is nothing that Luke would want more than to be with his family, but he doesn't trust himself. But you know what? At the end of the day, Luke was wrong, and that is the point of his arc. When he talks to Yoda, that whole conversation is about Yoda teaching Luke that it's okay to fail, as long as you learn from it and become a better person. Luke was wrong about him being the problem in the galaxy, but he overcame that fear anyway. People who don't like Luke in this movie should talk to someone who accidentally murdered a person. It could be through a car accident, it could be through any means. I bet you if you spoke to someone who accidentally killed someone else, they would share the same sentiment as Luke. You think these people trust themselves to be around others? No way! When someone turns to the dark side, that is basically a death of the person they once were. So Luke, in a way, killed Ben Solo. Luke doesn't want to risk hurting his family any further. He loves his family too much to go back to them and risk their lives. Now, you may think this is all extreme and that I'm exaggerating, but we're talking about a man here that has fallen into a deep depression. You cannot tell a depressed person that they're overreacting. That's just not how it works. But Goldman, Luke ended up saving his family anyway, so he was wrong the whole time. Yeah, he was wrong. and that's the point of this whole movie. Every main character that I have spoken about at this point was wrong about something, and they had to realize they were wrong and grow because of it. Even if you agree with nothing I have said in the past few minutes, that doesn't change the fact that Rian Johnson shared a powerful message with Luke's story. Luke Skywalker to me was always a character who represented the best in humanity. He was a good friend, a good leader, and someone who believed in the best in people. The Last Jedi turns Luke into someone with severe depression, someone who thought they ruined their life beyond repair and that there was no hope, someone who thought that they would cause harm to others in their lives. And you know what happened? Luke overcame that, saved the galaxy, and inspired millions to rise up against tyranny. That's the point of the final scene in the movie. This random kid on Canto Bight who has the Force was inspired by Luke. Luke, in the most Jedi way possible, saved the galaxy. He showed up through his projection, and once that happened, not a single other soul died besides himself. Would it have been cool to see Luke take down all these AT-ATs? Sure, but is that Luke Skywalker? Is that a Jedi Master? As Yoda once said, a Jedi uses the Force for defense and never for attack. What would he have accomplished if he was actually on Crate instead of just doing his projection? Did you want Luke to kill Kylo? Did you want him to murder a bunch of people in the First Order? That's not Luke Skywalker to me. The Last Jedi teaches us that it doesn't matter how depressed you may be. It doesn't matter how many people you have hurt. It's never too late to do the right thing and come back from it. This is the message of Luke's story in The Last Jedi, and I love it more than almost anything that Star Wars has done. Now I get it. It's not fun seeing Luke Skywalker be this depressed man. I would love to see Luke be the hero we all want him to be. But Star Wars to me is a series of stories that sends powerful messages that inspire people to be the best version of themselves. And to say that Luke's story doesn't honor that baffles me. Let's take a second to talk about Rian Johnson. I've seen popular movies that were divisive before, but for whatever reason, it was this movie that completely destroyed the fandom. All this woke shit and people disrespecting others in the fandom was nowhere near as prominent until this movie came out. Of course, it's easy for me to look at one side of the argument and say they're wrong, they're bigots, or they're brainwashed into liking or disliking certain things. But human beings are incredibly complex, and it's never that simple. Why do movies like this have such a differing opinion between the critics and audiences? After some deep thought, the conclusion that I came up with is that it's just the nature of Rian Johnson himself. You guys saw my opening little sequence I made in the beginning of this video. Rian Johnson likes to make movies that are divisive, but Rian Johnson is also a storyteller through and through. His top priority is telling the best story possible and will do whatever he thinks is necessary to do so. In my Andor video, I spoke about why a writer like this is great to have. Sometimes having your lead writer just focus on telling a good story and then have other people around him adding all the Star Warsy stuff is a great idea. But in the case of Andor, that show isn't important. Cassian is the main character in a show that is a spin-off of a spin-off. Besides episode 7, there isn't a single story Lucasfilm could tell that is more important than episode 8. More importantly, in a trilogy, arguably the most important entry is the one in the middle. Hiring Rian Johnson, someone who grew up with an indie background and someone who hadn't directed a blockbuster movie before, to direct the second movie in a Star Wars trilogy and also the movie that would feature Luke Skywalker for the first time in 34 years is an interesting choice. Whether you like this movie or not, getting someone like Rian Johnson for this role is rather strange. A pick like J.J. Abrams makes sense. He's known for directing popular movies and putting seats in the movie theaters. But funny enough, I could not think of two people that are more opposite as storytellers and directors as J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson. But anyway, Rian Johnson really isn't the choice of a director if you want to tell the most popular franchise movie. If you look at someone like George Lucas, his imagination inspired millions of people. Even though most people agree Attack of the Clones is not a great movie, children all over the world felt immersed by that movie and couldn't stop playing with toys of clones and battle droids. Rian Johnson is not the director that is going to sell toys. Now, this isn't inherently a good or bad thing. Tony Gilroy, the writer of Andor, is pretty much the same way. But again, Andor and The Last Jedi are completely different. If you ask people who love The Last Jedi, they will tell you how great the story is. They love the character work and they love the hidden messages and themes of this movie. But none of them really say this movie is cool. You don't see a generation of children playing with toys of the First Order or the Resistance. Now, you could argue this is J.J. Abrams' fault, fair enough, but Rian Johnson certainly didn't do the trilogy any favors. To a lot of fans, the canon of Star Wars is just as important as the story. But Rian Johnson is more than willing to bend or ignore the rules of the canon if it means telling a better story. The perfect example of this is with the Holdo maneuver. From a solely lead narrative perspective, this was a wonderfully crafted moment. You have three storylines going on at once, and for them to all converge in this moment along with the visual beauty of the aftermath is wonderful storytelling. But, as many fans have loved to point out, weaponizing hyperspace is something that Star Wars has never addressed, and thus it creates problems with the lore. Why has no one ever used hyperspace as a weapon? This certainly could have been beneficial at other points. And decisions like these are riddled throughout The Last Jedi, and this causes a divide in the viewers. Someone who studies the lore of Star Wars every day will probably get pissed off by this moment because it creates a hole in the franchise. But the reviewers at Rotten Tomatoes who have never read a Star Wars book in their life couldn't care less if this causes problems in the lore. Another example would be the throne room fight. If you were to examine certain shots closely, you can notice some holes in the choreography, most notably the disappearing blade that could have killed Rey. Of course, fans who love to analyze every detail of these movies will notice that. But Rian Johnson isn't as concerned with minor holes like these that people only notice when watching the movies frame by frame. He cares far more about the acting, the composition of the shot, the pacing, and a multitude of other details. Critics will see things Rian Johnson's way, while hardcore fans will see it another way. Now, to say this is the only reason that people like or dislike this movie is nonsensical. Of course, there are plenty of people out there who love stories who simply think the story of this movie sucks. And I'm sure there are plenty of lore junkies out there who love the lore of the sequel trilogy. I just think the reason there is such a stark divide is because of decisions like these. While it's easy to examine why this movie is so divisive, it's also important to note why this movie of the three sequels has the most supporters. If you were to examine people who love the sequel trilogy or love parts of it, The Last Jedi is the film that most people say is the best. Why is this the case? Is it simply because Rian Johnson is a better filmmaker than J.J. Abrams? Potentially, but I would argue it's all about authorship. The original 6 Star Wars films were George Lucas's babies. He put every ounce of his soul into those movies. His philosophies and morals and beliefs are all fundamental roots of the prequel trilogy. I would argue The Last Jedi is Rian Johnson's baby. All his beliefs about Star Wars and filmmaking in general are rooted deep in The Last Jedi. If you look at any series of films that are so widely beloved or have a strong fan base, they usually stem from a passion behind a singular storyteller. The Zack Snyder DC films aren't universally beloved, but its fans are so passionate about this trilogy of films because they love Zack Snyder's work. If you were to look at The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, would you say those movies are the babies of J.J. Abrams? Would you say that every ounce of J.J.'s soul and beliefs are rooted in those films? I would say not. This may or may not be J.J. Abrams' fault, but those movies lack the authorship of The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi is a Rian Johnson film. What would you say is a J.J. Abrams film? A film with lens flares? I couldn't tell you. So a filmmaker like Rian Johnson, who is passionate about his movies and has a distinct style to him, is most likely going to result in more people who are passionate about his films. That passion can be both love and hatred, and this is another reason why The Last Jedi is such a divisive film. So Star Wars The Last Jedi all these years later, I think it's fair to say that the legacy of this movie was its divisiveness. Now one could argue we should have seen it coming. 15 years prior to The Last Jedi, we were at the peak of the prequel trilogy, and those movies sparked similar outrage in the viewers as well. Now I'll let you decide which movies were more hated at the time, the prequels or the sequels. But an interesting discussion to have is how these movies will be viewed in the coming decades. Because if you were to look at this part of the fandom in the mid-2000s, the prequels were ripped on constantly. It was not an understatement to say these movies were some of the most criticized and hated movies of a generation. But flash forward 20 years and one could argue the prequels are beloved. Sure, most agree that Attack of the Clones and The Phantom Menace are films that aren't the best, but many praise Revenge of the Sith as the best Star Wars movie. Prequel memes have become more popular than ever, and Lucasfilm appears to be creating projects that will tie heavily into the prequels. So what happened? How can films this hated become so beloved almost 2 decades later? Some will point to the age of the viewers. Back then they were children, and now they are grown adults who have the strongest voice on the internet. This is certainly part of it, but there's still more to it. Some will say the prequels were never as bad as the sequels, but whether or not you think that, most of the criticisms that were levied at the sequels were also levied at the prequels, so it's not that either. Could it simply be that Star Wars movies tend to age better? Sure, but there's a specific reason why the prequels have aged so well, and that's George Lucas's investment in the trilogy. Yes, you have the 3 prequel films, films. But for kids growing up with those movies, what else could you dig your teeth into? Well, you could watch the Clone Wars show, you could watch the other Clone Wars show, you could play some of the top tier video games, you could read any of the dozens of books, you could read any of the hundreds of comics, and all this amounted into a world that prequel fans felt immersed in. I've always stated that what turns a franchise from being simply popular to being a pop culture milestone is not just the stories themselves, but the other ways you can invest time into the franchise. If you were a fan of the prequels, there were hundreds of different ways you can invest your time into that world. It's simple human nature that the more time you spend invested in something, the more you will like it. Compare everything that surrounded the prequel trilogy to what surrounds the sequel trilogy. Outside the sequel trilogy films, you got a few books, a few comics, part of one video game, and really not much else to explore. After the release of The Rise of Skywalker, it seems that Lucasfilm was scared to go anywhere near this era of Star Wars. If Lucasfilm wants the sequel trilogy to be remembered as fondly as the prequels are now, they need to devote more time to it. Make a video game about Finn, dive deep into the origins of the First Order, explore the relationship between Ben Solo and Luke Skywalker, create a new state of the galaxy to explore after The Rise of Skywalker. So time will tell if the sequels will age well. The Last Jedi is the heart of the sequels, and we will see how people view the most controversial movie of the 2010s.